Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So in part of my movie and TV fight review series, I'm going to talk now, because there have been quite a lot of requests for it, I'm going to talk about the fight between Oberyn Martell, aka the Red Viper, and Gregor Clegane, aka the Mountain, from Game of Thrones, of course. And so this is a fight that's attracted a lot of attention. First up, I'll say it's really nicely choreographed, one of the best fights up until that point in the Game of Thrones series, I think. Generally speaking, I think the fights in Game of Thrones have got better throughout the course of the series. I think they're a little bit weak at the beginning, but the fight choreography has definitely got a bit more interesting, or at least the editing of it has got more interesting as it's gone on. So first up, Oberyn. So Oberyn's armour and equipment. So Oberyn is using what I would call a partisan. It's a long bladed spear that he uses to cut as well as to thrust with, and it has a sort of some kind of spiky bits at the base of the blade, so it's definitely a kind of partisan. I'll call it a partisan. There are other potential weapons that you could match it up with, but I think partisan's pretty close to the mark. And he's wearing relatively light armour, looks like brigandine construction, so nice and flexible, and as Tyrion notes, he's not wearing a helmet, which you could say is a bit foolhardy, but hey ho, that's the way he goes. He's quite flash, he wants to move around, and he's quite confident in his abilities. And it must be said, to a certain extent, if you're using a pole weapon, a helmet's a bit less important than it is if you're using short weapons like swords or sword and buckler and such like. Okay, so first up, he does what we call in HEMA, we call it a flourish. That is, he takes his weapon and he twirls it around a lot and spins around and does lots of impressive kind of movements. This is, you could say that this is something that's sort of quite movie-like, or not particularly sort of realistic, but in actual fact it kind of is. There's this historical precedent for it from martial arts all over the world. We see it obviously famously in Chinese martial arts, and actually the way that he's moving the staff around, I'm fairly sure that they got a wushu practitioner to either choreograph or to actually physically do those moves. But flourishes themselves serve many purposes and definitely did exist in history. You do them to show off, you do them to show your abilities with a weapon, and also to intimidate the opponent as well. So, you know, the more flashy you look at the beginning of the fight, before the fight, while you're warming up and getting your body moving, all these kind of things, the more intimidating it can be for the opponent. So I don't have any problem with what he does there. I wouldn't personally flourish a partisan in quite the way that he does it, but it looks good, it looks flashy, it's fine. I think it's good, it looks nice, okay, it's good to look at. So, as I mentioned, it's important to note that the way that Oberyn uses the partisan is he's mixing cuts and thrusts. I don't really have a problem with this. If it was a normal spear, then I would complain that he was sort of hitting with it quite so much and should be using the point more. But it is a partisan, so it can cut and it can thrust, so that's absolutely fine. So the only caveat I would say is that against someone using a greatsword, it's not the best strategy. If the opponent has a large cut and thrust sword, using your pole weapon, your partisan, to cut and thrust equally. In actual fact, I think we can say that Oberyn actually mostly cuts with his weapon rather than thrusting with it, is not the best tactic. It's not what I would advise. In actual fact, the strength of the pole weapon is in the speed of the point and the speed of the disengage, as we would call it. That is the ability to thrust to one place, for example high, like the face, and then very quickly thrust low, like the knee or the shin, okay? And that means the person with the sword has to move their weapon a large distance to cover themselves, or dodge and move around a lot to avoid being stabbed. The big advantage of the pole weapon is it can go from high to low or left to right with a small movement at the back end and a big movement at the front end. Okay, so I would say he's not using the best tactics to fight someone with a greatsword like Gregor Clegane is using. However, he does have the best of the fight, and he does basically win the main part of the fight, so we could say that he's showing off and basically taunting, like a cat with a mouse, taunting his opponent. The next thing I want to mention is that Oberyn at one point uses the back end of his spear. After his front is knocked aside, he uses the back end to hit the mountain in the back of his helmet, and it actually knocks the helmet flying off the mountain's head. This is really good. It's a technique that we see in lots of historical fencing treatises and historical European martial arts manuals, and it's shown in Fiori de Liberi as a counter with the spear against someone who knocks your point offline. You just hit them with the back end. It's also taught in bayonet as well, where you hit with the butt end of the rifle if your point is knocked offline, for example, or if someone comes in too close for you to be able to use the front end of the spear or pole weapon, you hit them with the back end. So brilliant, really good stuff. I would say, generally speaking in the fight, that Oberyn does too much spinning and jumping. However, again, we can say this is excusable by saying that he's showing off, showing his abilities, and he's toying with the mountain and almost taunting him into more foolish attacks and getting more angry and more aggressive, and hence being easier to defeat in the end, actually. I think it's really good that they show lots of contact between the pole, the wooden pole of the pole weapon of the partisan, and the sword, because this is realistic. It's not easy to cut through the pole weapon, through the pole of a pole weapon, and it's really good that he's parrying the sword with it, and equally the mountain is parrying the thrusts onto the wood with his blade. It's good that they show that, and it's good that it doesn't just break or get chopped through easily. And it's also good that when the spear shaft, when the partisan shaft gets chopped through or snapped as such, it's actually against the ground if you look. So Gregor basically beats it to the ground, and it's that having the point resting on the ground and that pressure that actually snaps the shaft. And this is very realistic. This is the most likely way that you can break the shaft of a pole weapon. So really good stuff. I would also say it's really good, connected to that point, that the mountain does beat the point, beat the thrust attacks of the partisan, beats them downwards. That's good tactics, good fencing tactics. It's better to carry a point downwards than to carry a point upwards, because if it does hit you, at least it will hit you in the leg instead of in the face. Okay, so good fencing tactics there. He's beating it downwards a lot. And equally, if you're fighting against a spear with a sword, it's a generally good tactic to try and carry the spearman's point down, where you can try and bind it against the ground, or indeed stamp on it with your foot. And this is shown again in the fencing manuals from medieval and Renaissance Europe. Okay, so good tactics. Finishing off, I would say it's really good that Oberyn finished there with a sort of hamstringing like movement. It's a bit confusing exactly how that was supposed to happen. It seems like there were little spikes, little points at the bottom of the partisan head, and that he rammed one of those into the back of the knee of the mountain, which of course the back of the knee is an exposed, vulnerable point, even in full armour. And he seems to have then sort of ripped out. So it looked to me like he didn't really cut with the blade as such, or maybe he put the spike in and then cut with the blade. It's not really clear. Either way, it works. It was well done, well shown, and the only thing I would sort of say is that whilst in that bit they showed attacking an unarmoured part, generally speaking in the fight, a lot of Oberyn's attacks had been against armour, and we should point out that generally speaking a thrust or a cut against armour, against plate armour, steel plate armour, is not really going to do anything. You need to be going for openings like the armpit, the inside of the elbow, the back of the knee, any openings around the face or neck that you can have, back of the gauntlet, these kind of places where the plate armour isn't. Attacking the armour isn't really going to get you anywhere. However, again, we can go back to this same point of saying that maybe Oberyn was toying with his opponent and really just kind of like knocking him around, making him tired, making him angry, to make him look silly and to really hammer home the fact that he was toying with this guy and he could beat him whenever he wanted to. So I'm fine. From a theatrical point of view, I think it works. I think it's a great fight. I don't really need to say much about the ending, about how it finishes. I won't spoiler those of you who haven't seen it yet, but that all speaks for itself and I don't need to really say anything about it. So I hope that's appreciated. I hope maybe that gives you some insights into the fight and maybe helps you look at it in a different way. As per always, I'll put a link below this video linking to someone else on YouTube who's had the courage to host a clip from the original TV show, and you can maybe watch the fight straight after after you've listened to my video here, and maybe you'll see it in a slightly different light to before, and maybe notice some details you didn't see before. Cheers!